Do you ever find yourself considering the state of the world we live in today and wondering what on glorious earth any of us as individual people can do to help change things for the better? What role does our heritage play in an ever-progressive future? Well, if these are the sort of questions that you've been asking yourself, then I am absolutely thrilled to have you join me on this podcast, because these and similar questions are precisely those that are really the great inspiration behind my content, which is probably why you've come across me. But that still leaves a fair question. Who am I, and what am I actually trying to achieve? Welcome to Michael's Mission, the multimedia blog and podcast where we explore the role of entrepreneurship inspired by traditional values in creating great places for people in the 21st century and beyond. I think it's time for a formal introduction. I'm Michael Alford, a visually impaired creative entrepreneur with a passion for exploring the world and its natural, cultural and environmental heritage in search of ideas to help improve the lives of people and the world around us. Born in South Africa and raised traditionalist Roman Catholic, I've always had a great love of learning, sharing my knowledge, and applying it to make the world a better place. And as I became increasingly aware of the challenges faced by humanity and its planetary home, I felt that the best way in which I could do this would be to start and run my own business. I was fortunate enough during my high school years to be able to study the Cambridge International Examinations. And so naturally, when it came to choosing my subjects for IGCSE, or IGCSE as we knew it in that part of the world, business studies was an obvious choice given my desire to run my own business one day. This was indeed a great blessing for me because I was taught a very logical approach to the subject that really helped me to understand not just business itself, but the wider world and society, how society functions, and the relationship between events and the rationale of the people whose decisions influenced those events. In 2014, I moved with family to the UK, where I continued my education to A-level before taking up apprentice work with Bristol City Council, first as a business support apprentice and then as a finance apprentice. Though the mundane nature of the work which I was doing at that time did take its toll on my motivation quite a bit, I nevertheless found that I really came to appreciate the great value of even the smallest details within business processes and the impact that they can have on the smooth functioning of business and the wider world and society at large. But more profound, however, during this time was a voluntary role which I took up about the same time as I started with the council, researching and writing articles for Victor, which is a charity supporting visually impaired children and young people in the UK. These articles being for the then brand new Strive e-newsletter, which was just in the process of being launched. I absolutely loved the process of conceptualizing and preparing these articles for these first two editions which I was involved in, and indeed even much of that process of deciding how the form that this newsletter was going to take, who it was going to appeal to, and the sort of topics we were going to cover. And this led me to really think much more for myself about the potential of some form of creative work as a part of, or if not my entire career line. Thus inspired, I began to spend a lot more of my own personal time building up my own online presence on various different social media platforms. And it was through these efforts that I was to come into contact with the profession of urban planning. It was a profession which absolutely fascinated me, and this was quite relevant at a time when although I was working, I was on a fixed-term contract with my first admin apprenticeship. So urban planning really felt like a great profession to focus my efforts on getting into for the long term, because it encompassed so many of my different interests in the natural environment, in transportation, and a more recently developing interest in architecture, which had actually been the channel by which I was to find, or the means by which I was to find the profession of urban planning. But how would this all relate to everything else that I was interested in, particularly around the economy and supporting small businesses? Well, increasingly I've come to think about urban planning from the point of view of what you might call placemaking. It's often a concept that is thrown around within the profession. And when I first heard of this term, it sort of felt quite foreign to me. It sort of felt linguistically a little bit clunky. But at the same time, I've really come to see it as being the epitome of the sort of professional that I would want to be. Because thinking about urban planning in terms of placemaking recognizes that it's not just professional urban planners in ivory towers who shape the places we all live and work in, but it's the people, the everyday people, the workers, the businesses, the various different institutions at every level of society that all have their own role to play in creating and shaping these places. And if we want to create great places for people to live and work in, then we need to bring people with us, from the lowest cashier to the business managers and the business owners in different businesses and other enterprises. With this all in mind, then, I set up my personal website as a sort of a hub, if you will, for my online activities across different social media platforms. And not really being able to think of an awful lot by way of anything to call this website, I gave it the name Michael's Mission. And primarily it was intended to simply be a blog where I would discuss current news topics and current affairs issues from the point of view of a traditional Catholic and one who, more broadly speaking, is interested in traditional social values and economics and urban planning and in the wider culture. However, since I was spending a lot of my time working and had various other commitments, my time for working on the website was really limited to typing on my phone on the bus on the way home, which, if you've ever tried to do that, you will know is not the easiest way to produce large volumes of content. More importantly, because I was basing my opinions on a set of values which would likely have been somewhat unfamiliar to most of my intended audience, my first efforts were directed towards creating a set of standalone web pages which would explain what I stood for and why, so that those could be easily cross-referenced in blog posts and direct people to a slightly deeper explanation of the principles underpinning those opinions, so that if somebody thought, well, why is he talking about it from this perspective, where's he coming from here, there would be something of a resource to back that up. However, obviously, given the circumstances of the time, this was back in 2019, it really wasn't until the following year that I was able to publish my first actual blog post. Well, the world certainly was to change in 2020, wasn't it? Well, for my part, as the pandemic broke, I was concerned not just for my own safety and the safety of my family, especially as it emerged that, certainly in my opinion at least, the risk of the virus was somewhat overstated. But my greater concern was where the world was going and what this would mean for people like myself who, just at a very basic level, wanted to be able to live out our traditional religious values. With this in mind, then, I really spent far more time researching what was going on than was necessary, and that greatly inhibited my ability to produce a great deal of content at the time. But what I saw also fundamentally changed who it was that I wanted to be as a content creator, because I was becoming increasingly concerned as seeing a lot of debates taking place in the online as well as in the traditional mainstream legacy media, where it seemed like a lot of the arguments that were being made were not really responding to the opposing points of view. They were kind of just arguing past them or shooting past them. People were raising their own concerns and nobody was actually trying to address the other side. And that for me was just not really a helpful approach to trying to build consensus and actually chart a way out of this mess. And that to me is just not how a democratic society should function. And so therefore the question in my mind was, is more discussion of current affairs really going to be the answer to this issue? Well, needless to say, in my mind the answer was no. I felt really that the better use of my time would be to redevelop the blog. I was also thinking of expanding it into podcast format so that other people who perhaps weren't really particularly readers but found it easier to listen could access the same material. And in that respect, I chose to focus more on a series of posts that would start with the very basic fundamentals of what I stood for and why, and expand into a long-term and deeper investigation into the trajectory of the world, where we've come from, where we are now, and where we might be heading. And this also was quite significant because it brought back into the blog a much more central theme of the role of heritage in our communities as reminders of our past, of where we've come from, as a sort of an anchor, if you will, to understanding the trajectory of humanity and allowing us to reconsider, if you will, where we're actually going and where we want to be as a global society. Though my second apprenticeship did offer me a very welcome contract extension, which definitely helped as far as staying financially afloat during those tumultuous years of COVID concerned, it was nevertheless true that this was still going to come to an end. I was still on that fixed-term contract, which could only be extended so many times. And if I have to be honest as well, I felt for myself that this was really not the type of work that I could really do justice to in the long term. I would say to a certain extent I did enjoy the finance work. I found it valuable to do the apprenticeship, but it really wasn't something that I would find myself especially motivated to do in the long term, just spending my whole time staring at figures on an Excel spreadsheet. And so naturally then the question emerged, what was I still going to do? Now, certainly I had this long-term goal of getting into urban planning. However, there was this sort of a trade-off, if you will, of whether I would go to university and rack up a huge load of student debt or try to get an apprenticeship in urban planning, of which there were very few. And so that would probably mean a lot of time and effort on my part in an application which I may very well not succeed in. Well, another professional interest of mine which was beginning to develop at this time was that of photography. At first, I got into photography, I suppose pretty much for the same reason that anybody else might nowadays, that being to capture the visual memory of the places I've visited and the things I've seen. But over time, I increasingly came to see photography as an invaluable creative medium for visually illustrating and showcasing the places that really exemplify the sort of values for which I was advocating and still do advocate. And this to me was really invaluable because, as they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And being able to offer these visual illustrations of places where these values have been put into practice is a fantastic means of demonstrating the relevancy of these values for the 21st century in creating places that can be really special and mean something to people. And equally, by the same token, I would see photography as a means of reviving a sense of the past and the beauty of the old world and the world of back then, if you will. And that can also help us to really anchor ourselves in the past and where we've come from as a human society and the things that we perhaps have lost. With all of these thoughts in mind, then, I began to consider photography much more seriously as a potential profession. And I had been on a short 3-day course organised by Victor with the London School of Photography. And after I left the council, I went on to take another course in the King's Trust, going a little bit more in depth into the art form and the professional side of being an artist and a photographer. And these courses really helped me to appreciate photography not just as a medium of communication, but as a real art form in and of itself. The importance of the style of photography in capturing the story and communicating that to the viewer. Following from my time with the King's Trust in that first 2-week photography course then, I was offered another opportunity to join their Young Enterprise program, which consisted of an initial course into the details of starting up and running a business, followed by ongoing support over a couple of years. Which I thought to myself, well, this is a great opportunity to potentially build up for myself a bit of an income, which might perhaps be quite useful if, or more likely when, I go on to study urban planning, as I had been want to do. And if it didn't really work out, that wouldn't be the end of the world. I'd just go on and study urban planning anyway. But if it did, then, as I say, it would be a great source of income, which could be hopefully scaled up or down depending on other opportunities that I might wish to avail myself of further down the line. With this in mind then, I began revamping my old website, which at this point I'd now hardly worked on for quite a few years, and rebranding from Michael's Mission to MJ Alford to reflect a much wider commercial plan, if you will, that very much included the Jargon podcast in its more developed form, but also included the potential for other forms of content, and more importantly, showcasing more of a personal brand and more merchandise and other offerings which could surround some of my different content which I was producing. The other thing which I was then thinking about was also working directly with clients on, I suppose, what you'd call a more bespoke photography service. And that was my real focus on the enterprise scheme, because I felt that that would be a more reliable income to have on the business plan for sourcing potential funding. However, unfortunately, although I learned a lot from the program, I would also say that I kind of learned a lot of it too late to be of any real assistance in marketing this business and getting it successfully off the ground in the sort of timeframes that were expected of me. And as a result of that, I had to withdraw from the program and sort of reshuffle the business a little bit to account for the fact that I would probably need to start looking for a job in order to keep myself financially afloat before moving on to study at university. So then such a sort of a lengthy backstory, I suppose, illustrates a bit of the rationale behind what MJ Alford is today. That is to say, essentially a sort of a representation of my personal brand as an individual, as an artist, as an entrepreneur, and as a placemaker, I suppose you could say. If we were to sum that up then, the mission of MJ Alford, or the purpose of MJ Alford, is really to empower entrepreneurship as a vehicle for driving positive change and improving the places that people live and work in. The vision which I would then aspire to, the world that I would want to see and hope to help create through this enterprise, is really one of vibrant, happy and diverse communities and sustainable communities in which everyone is given the opportunities they need to thrive and to succeed and to fulfill their purpose and potential. The values then which underpin this business are inspired by my traditional Catholic faith, but they're not necessarily exclusive to Catholicism, if you will. Traditionalism is really the principle of placing value on the traditions that form and shape us as individuals and as communities, and they essentially become our communal and cultural identity that helps to bring communities together and to give them that unique character that really makes those communities and those places endearing and lovable to the people that live there. Classicism is closely related to that, and I would describe it then as the value of creating works of art that can really engage with the viewer in a sort of a language that is easily learnable, if you will, and thus easily intelligible to the viewer without a sort of an information board to tell you what a piece of art means. And in this way, whole places can essentially become works of art. And that's how we create places that people love to be in and appreciate and value and want to be there. Distributism is the economic application of traditionalism, as I would see it, and that being placing the emphasis on small businesses as the backbone of economic life, really wanting most of our enterprises to be small, to be flexible, and to ensure that the ownership of the means of production is as widely spread as possible, but it actually resides with individual people and not with the state, essentially. Corporatism is again closely related, but we're looking at this in the traditional understanding of seeing human society and seeing human enterprises and institutions as being part of the wider body, if you will, of human society. And thus it focuses our efforts on working in our various capacities, in our various professions, for the common good of all within society. Localism is the principle as well of keeping as much of economic and political life on as local a level as possible, so as to be really in touch and in tune with the needs of the local population, and thus creating places that are unique, but allowing decision making that really understands the impacts of those decisions and can thus be far more for the benefit of the people in that local area. Sustainability is the consideration of the medium to long-term ability of a society or an institution to be able to keep itself going and to sustain itself, that it might continue to deliver for the common good for years and decades and centuries to come. And finally, diversity here would be looking at the principle of valuing the contribution that people of all different backgrounds and cultures can make to the wider society. So these are the values which have essentially underpinned my online content all along. However, hopefully setting them out in this way would present a very basic overview of what I stand for, because some of them may be a little bit unfamiliar to some people, some of them may even seem a little bit controversial, but in my view all of them are absolutely vital, and really with the proper explanation I would argue that all of them should be relatable and understandable to most people. And that's exactly what we intend doing with Michael's mission, with this blog and podcast, is exploring those values, why I think there is still a case for them in the 21st century, and what we can all do to hopefully bring about a world that is more closely based on those values. It might seem then that these two ideas of empowering small-scale entrepreneurship and creating great places are kind of two very distinct things. However, I definitely do see these things as being connected, because I view the idea of empowering small businesses as being central to the objective of creating great places. In a sense, I would say that I see the challenges of the world in the context of urban planning. But I obviously recognize the fact that it's not just urban planning that creates great places. So essentially, to put this simply, the problem which I'd be trying to solve with this enterprise is the simple fact that we seem to be living in a disjointed and almost hardly functional society, which has been constrained, if you will, into an economic and commercial and cultural system that prevents us achieving a lot of the things which traditional values would have us achieve. And obviously I think that that is a very unfortunate thing. So we need to be able to think, well, how do we get back to the state of the world that we want? How do we create places that we want to live in? This makes me think in terms of where I fit in. What is the common thread between urbanism and placemaking and empowering small-scale entrepreneurship? This kind of thinking in turn led me to develop what I would call the 5P framework of change, because ultimately in the various different fields, the fields of economics and the fields of urban planning and the various related professions and disciplines, what we want to see is positive change, and that's why MJ Alford exists. Naturally then, the first place to start with all of this is the principles. What actually are the fundamental principles and values that we are going to start with in terms of thinking about what sort of world we want to live in, what we want the world to look like? Then we can take things a little bit more concrete by saying, well, what sort of places do we want to live and work in? The next stage then is to think about the process. How do we get from where we are currently to where we want to be? And more importantly, what is causing the world to be as it is? What sort of processes have led the world to be in the state that it is currently in? Then we can start to think about planning. How do we get from the current state of affairs, with our understanding of the processes as they currently stand, to the ideal state of affairs, the way we want things to work? Once we've got a plan in place, then we can start to formulate a policy, which is to think about the sort of more practical guiding principles that will help to keep our plans on track. And finally, we then think in terms of people, which is to say, who do we need to have the support of? Who are the stakeholders in our project or our enterprise that we want to have their support? And how do we get that? So this is a framework then that can be applied to any enterprise or organization or institution of any description. Because when I talk about enterprise and entrepreneurship on this podcast, I'm not necessarily talking about entrepreneurship in the stricter sense of starting up and running a business, or starting up a business particularly. I'm thinking more in terms of an enterprise in the wider understanding, that is to say, a human undertaking. an effort to instigate and to drive forward change. And that is ultimately what we're all about, because it's not just the people who start the businesses that are important. Some people are not born entrepreneurs in the sense of being people who are the right kind of characters to actually start a business, but they might be great people to initiate and drive forward change within an organization. And in many ways, the sorts of principles which are involved in initiating and engendering and catalyzing and powering change are the same sort of principles that apply regardless of whether you're starting up a brand new business or making changes within an existing business or institution. Having thoughts about the framework for driving forward positive change, the obvious question which comes to mind is, well, what does positive change actually look like? Well, it goes without saying that my view of that question is that it is change that is inspired by traditional values. And the reason I make that case is because if we whittle them down to their purest form, as we have attempted to do in very brief form at the beginning of this installment, and as we will continue to do in the following installments of Michael's Mission, we will find that these are the values that are fundamentally based on a very practical understanding of humanity, of us as people, of our purpose and our human nature. And with that understanding, then, we're able to apply that to all of the decision making that goes into creating the sort of places in which we live and work in, be they the wider public realm, the urban environment, or even the sort of institutional environment or the workplace. But that still leaves some serious questions to be answered, because at the end of the day, how are we going to achieve this? If you raise the idea of a return to traditional values with most people, you will probably get one of two responses. The first response that you're probably going to get from people is, well, that's just archaic and awful and not nice for everybody. Well, as I've already discussed, I would certainly make the case to the contrary, and will continue to do so. That's what this podcast initially is going to be about. But the second sort of response that you're then going to get is, well, even if they are a great idea in theory, they're very difficult to put into practice in the 21st century. Now, I can certainly see why people would struggle to see how they could be applied in the 21st century, because our world is so far removed from anything like real human-centered, philosophically sound traditional values. But again, I think it is very much in our human nature to see ideals and to want to aspire after them, and to not be bogged down by the obstacles that might come up for us, but to overcome them. And certainly I think when one really strips down traditional values to their fundamentals, you realize that a world based on traditional values may look very different now to the way it might have looked 200 years ago. But that doesn't mean that such a world cannot be created. What we need to be able to do is, as we say, strip it down to the fundamentals and then completely redefine how those are going to be applied in the context of a modern world with all the advances in science and technology that we are so blessed to have. With that in mind, then, I would very much be looking at a strategy of 4 sort of key strategic objectives, or core areas of strategic activity. And the first one is education, which is to say helping people to understand what these traditional values are and how they might be applied in the context of 21st century modern living. as we have already mentioned. The next point is empowerment of entrepreneurs and change makers in various different situations and stations in life, who are actually going to be the people to take those principles and values and apply them to different sets of circumstances and drive forward those sort of improvements that bring about that return to traditional values within society. The next point really is sort of attached to that, but that is inspiration, which is to say inspiring people, again, in various different circumstances to drive forward positive change. And I think this comes naturally when we start to realize just how many exciting opportunities open up when we completely reevaluate how the world works in the light of traditional transcendent values. And then the final point really is a sort of one of consultancy, which is to say offering knowledge and skills to those who want to bring about that return to traditional values, to help them to apply those values to specific circumstances and drive forward that change successfully. Now, it goes without saying that each of those areas of strategic activity are quite distinct, but they certainly are also linked in the sense of being focused on the same objective. But that still leaves a bit of a question open as to how I'm really going to do that, because again, because they are so distinct, they can be seen as being quite far removed in terms of the sort of areas of professional skills that might be required to do that. Now, I would see various ways of this potentially happening. Probably two of the most important are, first of all, this concept of thought leadership, which you often see being discussed in online circles and sort of bigger digital content creators and such like. Again, whether you would describe me as a thought leader, I'm going to leave that to my audience to decide, because it's a bit of an accolade that just feels a bit too sort of self-supportive and self-conceited for me to want to apply that to myself. I certainly am not a master in any kind of knowledge as I'm producing this installment of Michael's Mission, and I'm sure that there will be loads for me to learn even as I do continue my own journey of growth and knowledge. But I very much look at this through the lens of having an avenue to share the knowledge that I gain as I gain it, to help others to appreciate some of these issues perhaps from a different perspective that they may not have considered before. And then the second point, as we have said, is sort of this idea of in more practical terms, what you might call serial entrepreneurship. And again, I kind of dislike the idea of this, because I would far rather dedicate myself as a career to some sort of a consistent job where I could say I am an urban planner, or I am a photographer, or I am a creative. If I sort of say that I'm a serial entrepreneur, it just sort of feels like one of these sort of big business boys that grows companies to multiple figures and then sells them off. Again, I'm not necessarily saying that that's an intrinsically bad thing by any stretch. I'm certainly not saying that anyone who does that is terrible. I certainly recognize the fact that as one develops the skills to build and grow a business, the natural desire, in a sense, is to build and grow different businesses, to build and grow, or to solve different problems. And I would certainly see why I might myself land up doing something a little bit along those lines. But I sort of feel like I would far rather, in some respects, have a sort of a core station, if you like, a sort of a life station, as would be seen traditionally, where I could describe myself as a single profession, which sort of hopefully can underpin everything else. And that's why I like to think of a lot of the things that I do and am interested in through the lens of urban planning, because urban planning sort of does bring together all of these different thoughts and aspirations into a holistic consideration of the sort of places in which people live and work. So when it comes to thinking about those 4 major strategies which we've already discussed, the real question for me was, okay, I've built up this business, MJ Alford. What is this going to be? Where does this fit into the overall set of strategies, or overall strategy, if you like? And for me, the best positioning for this business would be to think about it in terms of those first and third strategies. The strategy of, first of all, educating and inspiring and empowering people in whatever states of life they may be, whatever station in life they may be, whether it's just the average Joe public who has little involvement in policy making apart from going to vote every couple of years, to the political leaders. What's most important there is that people are educated and understand the implications of the decisions that they make. And again, this is not meant to be me, talking about some of these issues as like a master of all knowledge by any means. It's definitely not designed to be that. It's more of a case of me as a sort of a journeyman, if you like, exploring and finding out information and passing on what I believe to be true and relevant and important for people to know and to understand. In practice, then, what that looks like is a division into 7 core content pillars. And I call them content pillars because they are primarily focused on online content. But MJ Alford is designed to be a self-sustaining business in its own right, independent of any other institutions or organizations with which I may be associated. And these pillars, they do overlap, but more importantly, they're also designed to support a wide range of products and services offered primarily through my main website, mjalford.online. Structurally then, we can see them as a sort of a hierarchy from the lower level pillars, which are more personable, where I would be focusing a little bit more on me and my experiences and how I've come to where I'm at and the impact that different life experiences have had on me, and talking a little bit more about how this applies really to everybody. And then as we rise up the pillar, up the hierarchy, we can see that we go through to more higher value products and services and content that's more niche focused on that sort of entrepreneurial and commercial focus to help people who are in greater positions of influence to actually make things happen. We can also think of these pillars as being part of a sort of a big MJ Alford thought experiment, where we start at the beginning and we think about a name and we think about a hypothesis, and we gradually progress through a method and reach a sort of a working conclusion. So we're really asking the question, how do we make the world a better place? And we're going to take a more logical, structured approach through the different stages or pillars of content. You can find these pillars, by the way, as different content categories on my main website, mjalford.online. Well, the first key pillar which we need to talk about then is Michael's mission, which is this multimedia blog and podcast, of which the first installment is the one that you are reading or listening to or watching right now. And this is kind of like the sort of executive summary of the entire MJ Alford system of content or thought experiment, where we really go through in a structural manner the problems of the world and how we've got to where we are, and also some of the good points of the world and what we can learn from, and how we can really build on the successes that we have and take on the challenges and solve the problems that we need to do so. Michael's Musings is the next content pillar or content category, and this is sort of like the working hypothesis of the MJ Alford thought experiment, where we kind of think, well, okay, what is actually going on, and in very raw, untested form, this is really where I'd be sharing some of my thoughts on developments as they occur and as they develop, and sort of developing the thoughts and the theories and the hypotheses that we will be testing in later content pillars. Moving on to Michael's motivation then, this is where we think a little bit more about what motivates us as people, as consumers, as entrepreneurs and managers. And I think this is also a really important point, because we really have to think, how do we harness the best out of people? How do we create it? Because it's, as we've seen before, it's people that are so essential to creating a better world, and it's people being on board and joining us. And so the first thing to understand is, how do we get the best out of ourselves, and how do we get the best out of other people, whether they are employees or consumers or managers or any other stakeholders in an enterprise. And so, as much as this was perhaps a little bit of a later addition to the framework which we've developed, it is, I think, probably one of the most crucial ones to have in there. Michael's media is then the content pillar or category where we kind of go out as a sort of a method to the MJ Alford thought experiment. We go out and explore places and explore ideas and understand in practice how things have worked, how things are working, and what we can do to improve them. And so this is really the content pillar that supports a lot of my travel and sort of vlogging content, but also thinking about, from my travels, what do those experiences mean, not just for me as an individual, but for communities? How can different communities learn from one another? Then we move on to Michael's modeling, which is a sort of a development of the information and the data that we've gathered from the Michael's media pillar to understand really how the world works, how people function, how institutions and societies function. And this draws on a lot of the logic and the skills which I started developing all the way back in GCSE business studies, where we take the knowledge that we've gained from Michael's motivation, from Michael's media, and develop that to form models by which we can understand how the world works, and then apply that information to empower change and to empower entrepreneurship. The next one is equally important, Michael's marketing, and this is where we talk about how we market an enterprise to stakeholders. And again, we're thinking here not just in terms of selling a product to a customer or consumer, but on a much broader level, a much more fundamental level, we're marketing an idea to people, whether that's a business pitch to investors or to potential employees or to any other individual or institution who might be necessary to bring on board in our enterprise. So again, we're taking information from the previous pillars, we're taking our understanding of how people work from Michael's motivation to think about how do we present our enterprising ideas to stakeholders so that they can come on board and help us to make those things happen. And finally, Michael's management is sort of like the final conclusion of the MJ Alford thought experiment, where we're thinking about how do we actually make things happen? How do we bring all this information together and drive an enterprise forward towards a successful conclusion? Unsurprisingly then, this brings us to some important considerations really, because we can see that these pillars, there is a hierarchy, but they're also cyclical and interconnected, as we saw previously. And yes, the main location for those will always be my main website, mjalford.online, but you'll also find a lot of my content on other platforms as well. And again, all that information is linked and hopefully kept up to date on my main website, mjalford.online. Now, while this whole online business, digital content creation setup sounds all very nice and exciting, it was never really intended to be the be-all and end-all of my career. And you might say, well, it could be. I could make a fairly decent living as a sort of a digital content creator and selling bits of merch and all the sorts of other different things like that. But at the end of the day, I never wanted to limit myself just to that, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, it is a very rough and ready kind of career. It has its ups and downs, as I suppose any business does. But more importantly, I would see it as an underutilization of my skills as an individual if I were to simply do the whole online business, social media content creation business and go no further. And really, there's a simple reason for that, I suppose, because it's all very well sitting talking about all of these issues and what can be done about them. But the time for action is now. And I don't want to be the one who just sits there, talks about everything, and doesn't roll up my sleeves and get my hands dirty and actually get on with helping to solve things. Now, that's not to say, of course, that I'm the one to fix everything. By no stretch am I making that out to be. In fact, I am on a journey as much as everybody else, and I'm only here really to share the resources and information that I have found so far as I go along. But at the end of the day, there's a reason why 3 of those 4 strategies we referenced earlier on in this installment of Michael's Mission were focused on empowering. In other words, we're not just educating, but we're giving people the tools to get on and fix things. Because at the end of the day, my view very strongly is there's only so much that I can do. I'm not a very good at sort of coming up with all sorts of different business ideas and stuff. But at least if I can be the person who can bring together ideas and help people to find those tools that will empower them to go and start different enterprises, whether that be brand new businesses or whether that be projects or initiatives within organizations and institutions, those are what is going to really change the world. It's not just the one person on their own. It's not just one business. It's countless projects, countless enterprises, countless initiatives across all levels of society that are going to institute a real change. And so when it comes to thinking about my photography, I suppose the way I always looked at it to some extent was, well, perhaps I might think about it in the sense of a sort of a medieval craftsman who has his main business, his main craft, but then also has some involvements in other social institutions in the city. And in a sense, that's his involvement in the running of the city through the guilds and through the various other social and governmental institutions. But at the end of the day, these are all just models for thinking of things. We could look at it in the sense of what you might call a squiggly career, or what people will sometimes term a sort of a serial entrepreneurship. And these are terms that I don't really like. I wouldn't like to necessarily apply them to myself because in a sense they don't really reflect my values. But again, all of these are just models for people doing what works for them, and sure, sometimes the values don't really align. They may not be what we would agree with. But I think my point here is I would see it as my responsibility to make myself available to help solve some of the challenges. And I love the whole saying, man proposes but God disposes. And to me, that's what MJ Alford is meant to be. It's meant to be my proposal. It's meant to be my offering. It's meant to be my bit of personal branding that kind of shows who I am as an individual. And as a Catholic, I would say, let the good Lord dispose of things as he would. I'm ready to put my best foot forward, and let's see what opportunities come up that will enable me to make that contribution that I hopefully can make, whether that be as a contractor, whether that be as a freelancer working for different clients, or whether that even be as a permanent full-time employee working for a larger company or some sort of similar institution. At the end of the day, those sort of things are smaller details in a bigger issue, which is me offering whatever services I can in the scope of my career, so that at the end of the day, when I come to the end of my life, I can look back and say that the thing that I spent the most of my time on, the thing that earned me my keep, was something that was really geared towards the common good and really made a real positive difference. And that is the most important thing for me. And that is why in this first installment of Michael's Mission, I've deliberately, I suppose you could say, kind of tried to keep things a little bit vague, because what I've tried to do is define who I am as an individual, as an artist, as an entrepreneur, what MJ Alford is as a business, as a representation of my personal brand, which can remain my own no matter what else I do, no matter with what other institutions I may be associated with. It's my means of connecting with people who share my values. And yes, in subsequent installments, we can then go on to discuss the sort of values that drive me forward as an individual, what I stand for, and how those might be applied, not only in the broader social context, but also how I'm looking at applying them through different stages of my own life and career. So that's really what's to come. And I hope that whatever situation you're in, you would feel that by joining me in this journey, you would get some sort of value, some sort of inspiration, some sort of education to take up your own journey to help to change the world, so that we can build a strong community of people, of like-minded people, sharing those same traditional based values, and go out and change the world through different initiatives wherever we may be, whether that be as entrepreneurs, whether that be as employees, whether that just be as members of a community. That is ultimately the core and the crux of my mission. That is what MJ Alford is all about. And I most thoroughly look forward to this journey, and to everyone who might join me on this journey. Please do join me. Follow wherever you get your socials. Make sure you're following this podcast. Make sure you are subscribed to the blog. And I hope to see you on subsequent installments. Thank you for watching.